I would do, if you look here in Ezra chapter 1, verse 8, it says, Even those did Cyrus, king of Persia, bring forth the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and numbered under Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And if you look at this name here, right in that verse, Mithridath, and you compare it to character in history, Mithridates, one of Persia. And this dude, Mithridates, was responsible for the destruction, in a way, kind of contrary to the book of Maccabees, of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is known in Hebrew as Harashe, the wicked. And he's called the wicked because this is what Hanukkah and Book of Maccabees, and I would argue a lot more than you think, is really cut down to. And it's really interesting when we look at Daniel 12, you see these, 3.5 years talked over and over again. And you see a lot of the same things from that 12 and 11, and the same things from 11 and 9, Daniel 9. And it becomes increasingly clear that Daniel 11 isn't talking about Romans like they would have you think, like the Millerists would have you think that it was really talking about the Catholic Church. But now that the Catholic Church is all the way done with, now they're thinking like some Jesuit conspiracy in the Catholic Church, working with Mystery Rome, or you really got to start scratching your head what they even mean anymore. But they think in the last days, the four beasts who were concurrent to one another, meaning at the same time, who, when you look at Revelation, had been fused into one beast. And they put them all together and say that's the statue in Daniel 2, and they confuse a lot of things. And things that they should be confusing, they don't. And what they should be confusing is Daniel chapters 9 through 12. And no, they weren't written at the exact same time as one another, because the end of Daniel 11 and beginning of 12 was written later, or all of 12. But if you don't read Maccabees, you're not going to understand who the king of the south is. The king of the south is, when you look at the history of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is Ptolemy VIII Euergetes, or maybe Ptolemy VI Philometor. But it ain't Nero, and it sure ain't the Pope. It's these Greek Iranian kings. And at this point, they became increasingly Iranian in the latter years after this, when the Parthians had successfully weakened the Seleucids. They became Indo-Greek, or Irano-Greek, or whatever. But at this time period, I don't know the degree to which they had the losers, their daughters, married into them, or what have you. But that's generally what a loser king would do, is if they want to have any chance in the world to come, it would be in terms of the final order of things, which would be the shalom, which would be submission to, the Noahide laws and the duplicity of the law. But this isn't necessarily for a few countries in particular, because if you look here at Daniel 11, chapter 41, it says, it's talking about the king of the north, who is this Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the wretched, the wicked, the Antichrist of the Old Testament. It says, he shall enter into the beauteous land. And I would guess at this point that there were sympathies with the Parthians, with the Iranians, but the Seleucids were seen as an enemy. And the Ptolemies were acting like they better represent what the people want, that they will allow them to speak their language or allow them to keep their cultures or their religion, whereas Antiochus just wanted, tribute, suzerainty, control, and just even stop the religion by setting up the abomination which caused desolation. Now, if Jesus uses the term differently, it's with good reason. And this is where I had a hard time understanding where, Don K. Preston, where he was coming from, because he stays faithful to the text, where I'm more critical, and I do apologize. I need to keep things more clear by keeping things quiet in here and speaking more articulately, and I need to formulate my thoughts better, and but they're just who I am. I don't like the quiet. I mumble. I don't stand up straight. I got all kinds of vices. There's just certain things about who I am which make me who I am, and I'm not saying I'm going to be self-righteous and just be who I am. I know I'm going to try to be better every day. But every person has their strengths and weaknesses, and a lot of things that are weaknesses of mine, some of them are the flip mode, coin flip, the other side of the coin to a certain gift, because there's pros and cons to everything. So to make a long story short, we have here Daniel 11:41. He shall enter also into the beauteous land. And though I think that a lot of the sentimental views of the beauteous land from Daniel would be Persian, and Ezra and whatnot. But as I was saying, Daniel 11 was written later, as well as parts of 9. And for that reason, you don't really have the full culmination. So when Jesus talks about the full culmination, it's as though he's saying something different than what I'm saying. And I don't mean to go contrary to what Jesus is saying, or has said, but what I think a lot of people don't understand is that this, because of being the latter days, the last days, this time that Jesus was talking about in, let's say, Matthew 24, Luke 17, Mark 13, Luke 21, when Jesus is referring to these last days, that he didn't want anybody to think of them as past, and the last days of the past were going to, at that point, no one could argue having not been fulfilled. And the fulfillment was not necessarily the cross, that it was the destruction of Jerusalem. And that has a lot to do with this plan that they had for, let's say, Joseph, who Joseph was going to be in many nations, but he's sold into slavery. And the plans for the nation, you know, ended up being salvation for the Jewish people because Joseph was given a large portion in Egypt. And this large portion is in the root of Joseph, which is in the root of Japheth. And Japheth, like Shem, who was blessed, Japheth was to expand, but bless and expand are meaning the same thing here, essentially. That it has to do with this idea of being fruitful and multiplying and becoming a large number that nobody could count. And so the plan for Joseph was a little bit different. And we can see this in John 8, where the Pharisees said they never even went to Egypt. Now, to understand what's going on here, you got to understand that the books of David and stuff were written much later, and that before the Yahwehistic tradition, there was this kind of Olek system, and the Olekim were scattered all along the pastoral, nomadic countryside, where Shiloh was the center point where people would bring their offerings as they went on their daily life, and so on and so forth. And Jerusalem was a backwater place associated with the accursed Benjaminites, see Judges chapters 19 through 21, and the Jebusites, who were Canaanites. And at the end of this time period, when we start seeing the Yahwehist tradition, you see something completely different than what you would associate with the Sadducees and the Samaritans. And if the Sadducees didn't have the resurrection, then it's quite possible they didn't have the prophets. And that way, like Ezra, were incredibly fundamentalist to the Levitical system, which had benefited them because, as Moses said, the people didn't want to hear from God directly. They wanted Moses to hear from God. And, Moses entered into the cloud. So this is like what Jesus said when he's going to be in you and you in him. Remember, God put his spirit in Moses. So that's God in him. And Moses went into the cloud. So that's Moses and God. And you're going to see a lot of important verses from Numbers 14, but I would distinctly verge from a lot of the scholars past when they say of a 4-book Pentateuch, that Deuteronomy was actually added later. And yes, it does contain a lot of differences, a lot of reiterations, while simultaneously changing it to where it can neither be a retelling of something else nor an addition to it, And but I would go a little bit further than these scholars would, whom put Joshua with these first 4 books. And as y'all know, Joshua isn't a very Jerusalem-centered book. And what's also important to witness from Joshua, as well as the beginning of Judges, is this role of Deborah. And this is also in Numbers with Miriam, but that she played the lyre and the harp, and that these instruments were the woman's way of musing the warriors into victory. And this is like when Jesus said, I played the lyre for you and you did not dance. This dance was a victorious dance, like David, when he brought the ark back. But, Jesus also said, when I bring you the morning, you did not lament, and This has to do with the other part of the Deuteronomist. There was the blessings and there was the curses. They're not only broken down into, chapters 28 and through 32 and all that, but even before that, when there's these two mountains and they were, one was for the cursings and one was for the blessings. And this is wholly different than the Samaritans. That the Samaritans, much to this Olakim system, this where the prophet was actually not related to them necessarily, like Balaam, for instance, and that these prophets were actually seers, and Amos was of this nomadic seer class, which wasn't part of the temple system. And the temple system of David and Solomon was instituted after the fall of Shiloh. And this, where I would differ from the scholars, is I would put the Elohistic source document well before the Yahwehistic one. And when we start seeing the Yahwehistic come out, although the timeline of Isaiah is the days of Hezekiah, and while the north was still functioning, that it was written much later, especially Deutero Isaiah and Terto Isaiah. And for that reason, it's firmly in the Yahwehistic camp, even though it tells of historical events from prior. And I'm getting a lot of this from Mr. James Atwell's book, The Sources for the Old Testament. And the dude was a Christian, by the way. Now, when it comes to the prophet system, this is very commonly seen in books that I believe are written by the same author, the Deuteronomist, who wrote Deutero Isaiah, which is a coincidence because it really means second Isaiah and not Deuteronomy Isaiah, because Deuteronomy means second law. So it's wholly not from Sinai, it's wholly from Horeb, but they try to conflate Horeb and Sinai and Moriah with Sinai and everything else when there's no basis for any of that, because they just take advantage of the fact that you don't know. And the temple system of the prophet is something we start seeing with 1 Samuel. And Samuel was not of Eli's sons. He was adopted. And Eli taught him how to listen to God. And so the word was always a separate part from the God, and his arm was separate from the God, and his king was, the God king, and, there was these different persons of God, all the way through the Old Testament. And the verses they like to go to, like the suffering servant, is not necessarily the one I would go to. Like if you read, Psalm 79:2, they talk about the servants being poured out, but then you go to the end of the chapter and they talk about the sheep, so the sheep weren't the servants. The servants seem to be this idea from the Lamentation where there were innocent people that were good, people in Jerusalem that fell by the sword, this idea, and but as I was saying about Daniel, just because things had been fulfilled sooner doesn't mean that the New Testament isn't playing on these same ideas. When Moses talks about the last days of Israel in Deuteronomy 32, that was probably referring to the northern kingdom even, as well as the southern, we come to find out. But that, that was the first temple and everything, that when it comes to its application, Paul is still using it. Paul is talking, like, when they talk about going down to Egypt from Hosea and everything, that they're using these things in a way that aren't really what you would think if you were really going to use some scrutiny. It's not what you would think it would to be. So when we're in Daniel 11, it's um, Daniel 11 verse 41. He shall enter also into the beauteous land, and this land, although it might have been Persia in some of the earlier books, at this point, this would be Egypt in Africa, but not as you would think it would be. It would be on the same plate as what you would think it to be, but it would be past Sinai into Asia, and this would be firmly in the Platonic dynasty, every bit as much as it was under the auspices of Pharaoh when it was Canaanite before the Shasu took over, or whomever took over, from basically somewhere between Elam and Persia, but that's not where they're sourced from. They're probably sourced from the Tartars of Scythia and the Yanomami, or the Cordillera people, or what have you. But there's different waves. Like a lot of these people that they think had spread out through the world, that was one wave, but they had posted up, as they spread through Haran and peopled what are known as the Gatusa, the Hatawa, or the Hittites. And these Hittites were probably another wave that once they perfected, a certain metallurgy for armory, that the rest is history. And this is why you don't see too many Semitic languages. And this is why they's really caught up with this hatred of the Greeks and the Romans and what have you, because the Romans and all them are Indo-European languages. And although these aren't divided along racial lines genetically, that they ended up becoming two camps. And the camp of the Semitic camp was actually the same camp as the Carthaginians and the Punics. That there was no difference between Canaan and Phoenician back then, or Hebrew for that matter. Y'all tripping. And so it says that this king that was favorable to, like the Seleucids was Menelaus. Menelaus is the name of a Greek god. You think that they were just hunky-dory, before Antiochus, tried to go into the holiest of holies and touch the goblets or whatever that we saw in Indiana Jones is strictly forbidden. And so it was well before that he was already putting pressure on Syria and Egypt and everything. He didn't care what happened to the Ptolemy, and that was this zero-sum game. That's a game of fools where they're trying to eat up each other's territory in the Game of Thrones, and that's a fool's game. And so he was basically made as a devil and everything. So when he die, when they destroy him, you ain't supposed to feel sorry for him. That this guy was a devil is what they want you to think. Much as they want you to think about the Canaanians like that. That in Numbers 13 that they were from the Rephaim and they're of the giants and everything, and which is rather contradictory, because if the argument started as they were if you look at the smallest people of all history, they may have come from Persia, and this would explain why these nomads had from way over in had thought of these Canaanians who were squarely in Egyptian territory as giants. But then when it comes to the Davidic tales of giants, you only seem to find them amongst the Philistines, and the Philistines genetically were Grecians, we've come to find out, and they didn't even exist in the time of Moses, even though the Bible clearly says that Moses was, turned around because of them. But that's because this 400 years with between Moses and David is how would they really know? Like, they didn't have their own. We don't even have our own language. King Louis. So as I was trying to explain last time, I wanted to talk about Revelation and all these people being drunk with the wine of her fornication. And hey, brother. Hey, I'm just now seeing this, bro. I don't know how long that's been up there, bro. I love you, bro. I was just getting into Revelation right here with so he'd be carried away into the spirit of the wilderness, and he saw the woman sitting outside the beast was full of the name of blasphemy. Well, we had seen how Paul was chief of the blasphemers. He would call himself chief of the blasphemers. When was Paul chief of the blasphemers? When he was persecuting the church, the saints. And this is who we find the harlot is drunk. This is what her wine is the blood of the saints. But I do not see where it's Rome. So I'm trying to posit a new suggestion. And this is because of I was trying to show y'all with Romans Daniel 11:41. So with Daniel 11:41, we see a couple people escape out of there, and so this beauteous land, which I try to say for about 15 times, was actually Egypt. But he said these will be delivered from his hand. This is the Bible. This is Daniel talking, delivered from his hand. Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammonites. These are all Hebrews. People will try to tell you otherwise, but it's not really how it is. These were the Hebrews, and that's what you would expect. You would not expect these hard line differences between the Yehudim and the Goyim based simply on these cultural things for 1,000 years on end, because they would be fusing into each other, and these people near them would be adopting similar customs, and they would be adopting similar customs to their neighbors. And it's not like their neighbors were just bad and they would never follow the same God or anything like that. So these hardline definitions, you could not expect that to go on for thousands of years, from what they say 1800 BC until to even today, but biblically until 2,000 years later. It doesn't really make any sense. And here is clearly in Daniel 11:41 saying how Edom, Moab, and Ammon will be saved from the king of the north, and who a lot of people call the Antichrist, which is in a sense the Antichrist, but not as you would have you think for the last day. It was referring to this guy Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was the king of the north, who went against Ptolemy, who was the king of the south. And the rest is history. So when we see that this woman was drunk on the blood of the saints, we know that the cup was filled up, that they fill up the measure of the cup with the blood of the saints after they killed the Son of the living God. And Jesus clearly laid that out. Paul clearly laid that out, that that's how they fill up the measure of sin, when they kill the saints. But the people who kill the saints, Jesus is saying, is the same people who killed the Son of God, who is the same person, people who killed the prophets. Well, you could say maybe, the Romans killed the saints. Possibly, indirectly, they killed Jesus, but you can't say they killed the prophets. Who killed the prophets? It wasn't the Romans in any kind of way, shape, or form. Jesus says clearly in Luke 13:33 that it's impossible for a prophet to die outside of Jerusalem. And for thousands of years, you think Romans were controlling Jerusalem, And so, but the angel said to me, why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery. So this is a mystery, so it's not going to be obvious. So if you go back to Old Testament and look up Babylon or harlot and try to figure it out there, it's not going to necessarily lead you in the right direction, because this is a mystery, And we know Babylon on earth had been destroyed, long by this point. So people talk about this mystery Babylon, and they convince themselves that it's the Pope in Rome, when the Pope in Rome didn't even exist when this was written, and they weren't the ones persecuting the saints. Before, Titus and all them, Nero and all them, I don't know of any Domitian and all them, and though these don't get twisted. These three emperors were all 70 AD. It wasn't like all the way through these 40 years of the second Exodus between Pentecost and the destruction of the temple. It was only after the destruction of the temple that you could even really consider persecution of the church. And if anything happened around the time period in terms of persecution of the saints, it was probably they're getting lumped in with groups that were rebellious towards Rome, and just collateral damage, because a Christian's not necessarily against Rome, but if they were associating with people that were, then they could have been hit in that way, but you think God would protect them and not let their lives go to waste like that, for a fight they weren't even part of or whatever. But I see it differently. I think he would allow them to pour themselves out for their own people. If their people want to take their lives, that they would allow this. You don't repay evil for evil, and you don't go to the law with people, and you don't, you're taught to turn the other cheek and things like this. And so when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is, so when you talk about was and is, not yet is, and you go to Ephesians, it talks about already but not yet. This is because of what I was telling y'all about the 40 years of the second Exodus. And this is for the 40 days that Christ had taught them about, the new way. So when Jesus told Peter, you're going to be converted, go bring your brothers to me, then go out in the world, teaching to every nation. What did he do? He stayed in Jerusalem. He didn't go to all the nations. He was still tripping about Cornelius, even on Acts 9. And so here's Peter not even doing what he's supposed to do in the first place, and not following what Christ had told them to do specifically. And why was he not? Because he was seeing Gentiles as being dirty, filthy. He didn't want to be unequally yoked, because he was thinking that some of their nasty would rub off on him. And he's not understanding the deeper mysteries. He's not loving his neighbor, because his neighbor, like we see in the Good Samaritan, isn't necessarily the Levite or the priest. The Good Samaritan was somebody who he might have thought was, nationally his enemy, but, treated him as a brother. And we see in the law of Moses, it says, if you beat a slave and they survive, there's no punishment against you. Meanwhile, when Moses saw a slave being beat and he survived, Moses thought he was guilty of the death penalty. And that's when you go and you read the Bible, is everything that they all did was hunky-dory at every time. When That may not be the case. It may be that they were trying to expose the good, the bad, and the ugly, or tell you how far people come, or some other interpretation differently than these people were just amazing. David was an adulterer, David married a mother and a daughter. David married other men's wives, And do you know why? For his own lust of the flesh, for his own dominance and sadism and everything. And it wasn't, just so that a certain seed could be born, and that God was doing this, like they would have you believe. And there are also 7 kings. So you just read on down, and peep, please. Would you please peep? If we could go back, Revelation 17:4. And the woman was arrayed with purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her head a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. Well, you go to Exodus, and you go down to chapter 18, verse 8. And when you read it, say, and the skillfully woven band, this is talking about the priests, their tunics and their girdles and their turbans and their bracelets and all the things they had, their breastplates and what have you, they was decked out from the floor up. And it's and they were skillfully woven band, and there with a gird on it, shall be the work thereof, and of the same piece of gold and blue and purple and scarlet. So we got the gold, we got the scarlet, we got the purple, right on the priest. And you got all these fine stones and what have you. And, this tunic is supposed to have on the girdle of it, in verse 5 here of chapter 28, gold and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen. So this is what the priest had. When Samuel tell you that the priests of the north of Shiloh, they got fat, and Micah will tell you that they was, getting indulgence payments and stuff like that. When we see here, David was rich. We see them getting indulgence payments and getting fat and rich. When we see here in Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 31, whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. So there's all these needy people out here, and everybody wants to get close to the king because the king is the most powerful, and he's got the most money and the most sway and the most privilege. So they want to sit with the king at the king's table. That was considered like the highest honor, and they didn't even think, what if you sat down at the king's table and were asked to go sit somewhere else? How embarrassing that would be, And they always want these chief seats. And, but like I always wanted to say to my dad, he would want us to hurry up to get out to church, and, so we could get the front row seats. But here I'm thinking, well, what are all these old ladies doing in the back standing up? Like, should they have the chief seats, the widows and the orphans and all that, you know what I mean? And so that's just how people are. They want the best things in life and all the Joneses and stuff like that. But when you think about it, things like money and other resources, there aren't an infinite quantity of them, and money doesn't even have a real value. So if you had more money, it actually makes other people poorer. So when we strive to just have more and more and more, it's kind of a zero-sum game, because it comes at the expense of other people, because there are things that are rivalrous, there are things that are exclusive, and when you have them, as much as I want you to have them, if you get too much, you get greedy, then that could come at the expense of somebody else. And if we're all on this earth, then we should all get a little share and whatnot. And so when you go to court, the rich already have all the lawyers. They already have the persuasion of the judge. So if you want to have a just system, here's a mitzvah. I got a mitzvah for you. You can put this in your mitzvah team, that they should have preferential treatment of the poor, that there should be mitigating factors for light and culpability for the poor. There should be debt forgiveness. There should be all these different things to support the poor and make it easier for them to stand up to these bigwigs, but instead they don't do that. The white collar people get the slap on their wrist and everything. This is injustice. This is criminal. This is misapplication of justice. This isn't a mitzvah. There aren't mitzvahs. Sorry, there aren't mitzvahs that say, there are not mitzvahs that say, well, make sure that when he's poor, that you give him a public defender and things like that. They just, give it to you. You don't want to stand up against a priest or whatever. So if you look at chapter 28 of Exodus, lots of gold, lots of purple, lots of scarlet. It's all over. And so this harlot, this is that all the nations made fornication with, has to do with, just as we saw in Daniel 11:41, these different nations who like the Punics and other people. Like, you can go look at Hannibal, his name. It's like Hananiah. You have Han as being a name, a phoneme in Hebrew, and Baal is, you best believe, a very significant Hebrew phoneme. And no, it's not like you think. Like, oh no, it was the evil Canaanites. That was their god. No, this is from the tradition that came through Ugaritic, which was the Semitic culture, through Akkad and Mari and all that. So don't even start with me. And so all these people were drunk on the fornication. When they rose up and they thought they defeated like a legion or something at Beth Horon, and they said no one can make war with the beast and whatnot. They was feeling very confident. And when we get to chapter 18, it says it has become a dwelling place for the unclean. But it's not unclean as you think. It's not like these ceremonial unclean, because I'm sure even the priest of Shiloh, Eli's wicked son Phineas or whatever, he probably on the outside looked ritually clean. He was like a whitewashed tomb of sorts, probably. He needed to be converted. He needed to make the inside good, was his problem. His outside probably wasn't fine. He took the young ladies into the secret place. The priest got a secret place because that's where they could eat in peace all the best parts of the animal that were given a sacrifice, and they were taking the young ladies in there and getting it in behind the curtain. They said, don't look at the man behind the curtain, because you don't want to see how sausage is made. You don't want to see the bad side of politicians. They shouldn't even put that Monica Lewinsky thing on camera. That's just their personal thing. JFK, if he was getting in with Marilyn Monroe, well, that's just his personal business and what have you. In the glorious for stuff with the luxurious. So I think that this harlot was the city of Jerusalem, which included the whole temple system and everything. And the beast that rode it was their military system, and that it was dealt a wound, and that wound was the killing of their own Messiah. So that was the wound that had been dealt, but it was still living. It already was dead in a sense, but it was in these last days, dying off fully, and so a lot of verses we can't really understand because it's only true for a particular point in time. This 40-year window where the Christ had been crucified and the temple was still standing. So it was still there, but it was on people to decide its value if they were going to choose to leave. And at first, at least until chapter 9 of Acts, Peter did not leave. Peter stuck around when he was told to leave. And look at all these things they got. They got cinnamon, incense, fragrant oil, frankincense, all these things. Well, this is like what they thought was their society. If you go back to Sumerian and the oldest forms of these people that had swords and chariots and things like that, and nomadic dromedaries and camels, not camels, but like all that goat milk and all that. When you follow them all the way back, traveling from Persia to Arabia with your this is like the magi's and everything with your herbs and your frankincense and your incenses and stuff like that. That was a big thing they was doing, was these traveling caravans that went around, and this was part of Jewish culture, that they were merchants and nomads and things like that. It wasn't the temple system, like I was saying, we start to see later. And anything that happened before Assyria, we don't know much about, but and even after that, for that matter. But we do know what Sennacherib had said, and so yeah, I'm gonna my mouth is getting tired of talking. I've been John. I was trying to find my bliss. Oh, I found my bliss lip medics. It's always, I swear, it's always that. Whenever I ask is when I find it. I was like, whenever I say I can't, or, whenever I say it aloud, ask and I shall receive. Like, I swear, like, I was looking for this, and as soon as I said something, I was like, here's my, so I guess I could talk for a minute more, but I don't know what I was going to talk about. I can't remember where I was going. Yeah, they have the altar of incense, verse 30. We were just talking about in Revelation, the incense and everything. This is what they was doing. It was part of their ritual cult to have incense and gold and stuff like that. And this is what they really didn't like when people come around and mess with, because this was how the priest was making money. Moses didn't want the people talking to God for himself, because that would cut out the middleman, So Moses was going to intercede for them. I don't know. I love you, brother Rich, man. Thanks for coming, bro. I miss you, bro. Haven't talked to you in forever. We should chop it up sometime. All right. Love you. Peace.